each other in prayer. Several cried. Remember Ramona's dad. Remember my mom. Yeah. Keep Randy and Linda in her prayers. Keep Mike in her prayers. I know he's. Yeah. Mike, would you like to start us in prayer this morning?
Are you glad to be here this morning? I'm glad to be here this morning. It's good to be in the house of the Lord on a foggy, drizzly, rainy Sunday morning. So we're going to look this morning into more of dealing with problems in the church. And the title of our lesson this morning is Warnings Against Idolatry. And a lot of people, when they think about idolatry, they think about in the Old Testament how people had these false gods they worshipped, and they would build, some kind of statue or make some kind of monument of some sort that they would, sacrifice there to that god, and they would bow down and they would worship that god. And we don't think of idolatry existing today, but it does. An idol is anything you put in the place of God, anything that you elevate to a point that you are seeking after that more than you are God. So people today can make idols out of their jobs. They can put their jobs before God. And I realize, some jobs you do have to work. My daddy spent many, many years working on Sundays sometimes and on Wednesday nights sometimes, just because that was what his job required. But if you have an option of working or not working, you need to choose to be in the house of the Lord if you have that option. And so some people put jobs in front of God. Some people put money in front of God. Sports, TV personalities, social media, family members, friends, anything that we put above God is an idol. And so we're going to look this morning into Paul and his teachings to the Corinthians about idol worship, about idolatry. We're going to start off in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Paul here is helping the Corinthians understand that Israel experienced a spiritual encounter with God. Even before Christ came and was born of Mary there in the stable, he existed in heaven. He's an eternal being. And so even before he was born here as a human, he was existing. And the Israelites enjoyed a relationship and the benefits of serving God. They were led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. God parted the Red Sea, and they walked through on dry land. God provided them with quail to eat. He provided them with manna, with bread that rained down from heaven for them to eat. He had a rock that kind of traveled with them. Can you imagine? I mean, that's what Paul says here. He says, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. God provided for their needs. And yet, they were not happy with what they had. They passed through the Red Sea, out of slavery into freedom. That Red Sea experience, in a sense, symbolizes water baptism. The waters parted and they walked through those waters on dry land. But it symbolizes water baptism. When we were saved, we were in slavery. We were in bondage to Satan. But when we gave our lives to Christ, we were saved from that. And we were baptized in water, and we're continuing our journey on to that promised land of heaven. So the things that happened to the Israelites in the Old Testament very often foreshadow the work of Christ in the New Testament. And Paul's given the Corinthians a look at what happened with the Israelites. Hey, the Israelites had a spiritual encounter with God, just like you've had a spiritual encounter with God. It was a little bit different, but it was still a spiritual encounter with God, where they were freed from bondage. Let's look at verses 5 and 6. But with many of them, God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. The one really, really bad thing about the Israelites is that they had a complaining spirit from the very beginning of their being delivered from Egypt. From the very beginning, they asked Moses, were there not any graves in Egypt that you've brought us here? Oh, we should have just stayed behind in Egypt. Maybe we should just go back to Egypt. I'm sick of this manna. Can you imagine? God raining down bread from heaven. And people saying, I'm sick of this. I'm ready to eat some onions. They must have really liked onions a whole lot more than I do. I mean, I like onions okay, but if you give me a choice over some good bread or an onion, I'm going to take the good bread. Don't even have to think about it. Hand me the bread. You know, they had that complaining spirit. Focusing on what you don't have or the difficult circumstances you are facing will blind you to the blessings of God. They were blinded to the blessings of God. They had a difficult journey through that wilderness. It was hard. It was dry. It was dusty. There was no food readily available that they wanted, that they desired. And they complained, and they lost sight of that God had rendered a glorious deliverance. Let's look at verses 7 through 9. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Here Paul starts naming some things that are specifics that the children of Israel did. There in verse 7, when it talks about the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, that was when Moses had gone up on the mountain to talk to God and to get the 10 Commandments from God. God had thundered and lightning on that mountain, and the Israelites had said, we don't really want to meet with God, Moses. You go up and find out what he wants. They really didn't want that close encounter with God. Did you know there are some people that are content to just stay at the foot of the mountain? They want to be called God's people, but they'd rather not get that close to God. because getting close to God requires holiness. It requires living right. And they just really didn't want that. They want to stay down there at the foot of the mountain, stay on the outskirts of things. And they wanted to play. They built that golden calf. That one that Aaron said, "Well, Moses, I just threw some jewelry in there and out came this calf." What a dumb lie. I mean, surely you could have thought of something better than that, Aaron. My goodness. But that's what they wanted. They didn't want that close encounter with God. They wanted to have a good time. And then there was a situation where they got some captives, and they had relationships with those captives. And God had told them, don't mix and mingle with the people you meet along this journey. They'll corrupt you. You've got to be careful who you mix and mingle with. You'll wind up corrupted. You'll wind up. You wallow around in that pig pen, you're going to get some mud on you. You got to be careful. And then in verse 9, it talks about them being destroyed of serpents. There were fiery serpents that came into the camp and bit them and killed some of them because they were complaining against Moses and complaining against God. And God sent punishment to them. I ask you this morning, what do you do when you become frustrated with your situation? What do you do? Please don't ask me. I don't want to admit it. It's very easy for me to allow my frustration to get out of hand. Very easy for me to allow that to happen. We've got to be careful. It's so easy when you're frustrated to point fingers at others. Well, I wouldn't be in this situation if it wasn't for that one and that one and that one. And very often it's the leader that takes the brunt of that. Whether it's the leader in the church, the leader in your workplace, the leader in the family. Very often it's the leader that gets blamed. Well, I wouldn't be so miserable if you hadn't made me move here. I wanted to live in Jasper, such a cute little town. You brought me up here where there's not any stores, except the pig and the $2 stores. We can point fingers at others, but does that really help anything? It helps nothing. There's a saying that adversity builds character. You go through tough times, you become a better, stronger person for it. I'm a testimony of that. Seen some rough times? What did it do for you? What kind of person did you become because you depended on God and persevered through those times? Did it strengthen your faith? Did it give you a compassion towards people that are going through the same situation now that you went through? It builds character. God uses those trials to build our patience, to build our compassion, to build our love for mankind, to draw us to Him. He uses that. It's not pleasant. I've never heard anybody say, I can't wait till God puts me in a desert place. Nobody really wants to go there. But it helps us to grow in the Lord when we do. It builds our character. Think about people who do military training, basic training, those first weeks of a person joining the military. Those recruiters, a lot of them will spread out these papers and they'll talk about how these young men or young women you can travel the world at the expense of the military. Sure can. You sure can. But I don't dare say that's not Siri. That's the Android version of Siri. Apparently, she thought I said her name. She's trying to talk to me. I don't want to hear from her. But with basic training, you have people who have this vision, these young, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who have this vision of, oh, wow, I'm going to get to go to Hawaii. And they get sent to Alaska. Oops. Wasn't what they planned. And they have that 6 weeks of basic training that's kind of a test run of, can you endure physical hardship? And can you be away from family and withstand that? Because if you're going to join the military, you're going to be separated from family. You're going to miss birthdays and holidays and, those kinds of things. That's a part of the training. But it builds that character in them that they need for when they serve their country. Firefighters. How do firefighters train for a fire with people trapped inside? They gear up. Carry, 50, 60, 70 pounds of gear on their backs. Put an oxygen mask on. And go into a building and crawl, army crawl, find the victim that's in the fire without the building actually burning. Although some fire departments may practice that way. Put that person on their shoulders and crawl back out with that person. That's not easy. It's not easy. But it trains those firemen, those firefighters. Better be careful about saying firemen. I'll make some women mad at me. Firefighters, it trains them that when an actual fire comes, they can meet the challenge of what they need to do. It builds their skills in that. Police officers. I had an aunt who was a police officer. She'd go to the firing range in Hamilton County. They'd load guns up with blanks and they'd shoot each other. They'd play cops and robbers. They'd go into little buildings they had built to simulate apartment buildings and houses and, convenience stores or whatever. And, they'd hide behind things and try to shoot the bad guys instead of getting shot. And they'd have people pop up that would be, innocent children. You fired the blank. Oh, you just killed a kid, It helped them to train for when those situations came. God trains us. He gives us trials and tests. The devil tempts us, and God uses that for our good so that we can withstand the trials that come our way. And so sometimes we can be a part of rescuing people. We can't save people, but we can witness to them. God trains us to be able to go in to a total stranger and just say, where do you go to church? Are you going to church this morning? No, I have to work. Well, are you working next Sunday? Yeah, I work every Sunday. Well, what about Wednesday night? Trying to find those people who are just looking for somebody to say, would you like to go to church with me? God's training us to be able to do that. That's out of my comfort zone, I'll just tell you. I have to push myself to do that, to invite total strangers to church. I have to push myself, but it's my responsibility to do that. God's called us to witness to people. Let's look at 10 and 11. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Up above there, in verses 7 through 9, we have people who were eating, drinking, and rising up to play, and they're going to worship a golden calf. And we have people who committed fornication. And we have people who tempted Christ by complaining about Moses and complaining about what God was doing. Be careful about saying, I would never. We want to look at that and go, well, those dumb Israelites dancing around a golden calf, well, I would never do that. Those Israelites getting in a relationship with foreigners that God had told them not to be a part of, well, I would never do that. But are you grumbling and complaining? It's mentioned in the same verses. Oh my goodness. See, we want to look at those big sins, those sins that we are so clear is wrong, those sins that we would never do. But are you grumbling and complaining? I've been guilty. I've been guilty. I'm not going to stand up here and, act like I'm, without doing wrong. I've been guilty of grumbling and complaining. Even recently, grumbling and complaining. Why does God hate grumbling and complaining? Why does he put it in the mix with this other stuff? Because when you're grumbling and complaining, you're the idol. You're putting yourself above what you're in and saying, I'm too good to have to put up with this. I'm too good for that. I want to serve myself and others serve me. I don't want to be a part of this unpleasant situation. Others join in with your grumbling and complaining. If I go over here and I start sharing with Sister Heather how bad my week has been and all that's gone wrong, and I'm grumbling and complaining, she's going to hear me, and then she's going to start thinking about what's gone wrong in her life this week, and she's going to start grumbling and complaining back to me. And then Sister Tammy's going to come up, what y'all talking about? Well, we were just talking about how bad our week's been, and Sister Tammy's going to start telling us about all that's happened to her this week that was bad. And before you know it, everybody is focused on the bad things that have happened in their lives for that week. And there's no talk of the blessings of God. We've got to focus on the blessings of God. Even if the other people you're talking to don't grumble and complain with you, your grumbling and complaining may discourage them. Grumbling and complaining brought discouragement to the children of Israel. It was time to go into the promised land. And Joshua and Caleb said, we can do it. Let's go. God's with us. But because the other 10 of those 12 spies grumbled and complained, the whole group gave up. Oh, we can't do it. Did you hear what they said? We're like grasshoppers to those giants. We can't do this. Why did God bring us here like this? We've spent all this time out here, and we may as well have just stayed in Egypt. Let's just go back to Egypt. They were discouraged because of the grumbling and complaining. Very often, when there's grumbling and complaining, people become discontent with the leadership. They find someone to blame. I wouldn't be in this mess if it wasn't for fill in the blank. How many times have I said things like that? I mean, I'm guilty. I would enjoy teaching school if it weren't for, and I can name you some people, but I won't do it publicly. And it's not children's names. I can just start naming my list of people that just ruined my role as an educator. No, they don't. The only way those people have power to ruin my enjoyment of education is if I allow it. If I say, you know what, I'm going to go into that classroom and I'm going to enjoy what I do. then I can go and enjoy what I do. But if I go in there and I say, if it wasn't for this one wanting this, and that one wanting that, and that one wanting that, before you know it, all I'm focused on is what this one and that one wants, instead of just doing what I need to do. Focus on what God has called you to do and take joy in it. And if you're finding yourself in a situation where you can't take joy in something you're doing, maybe it's not your calling. Maybe you're trying to operate outside of your calling. You need to seek God for, God, what have you called me to? Because what God has called you to, you should find joy in doing. I find joy in teaching Sunday school. I enjoy it. I know God's called me to that. There are things I would not enjoy. I cannot drive the church van. There's no amount of begging, pleading, paying, anything that will get me on that church van. Can't do it. I do well to keep my own van in the road. Sometimes Steve has to tell me, baby, you're missing your turn. That happened last night. It wouldn't have ended well if he hadn't spoken up. We would have probably been calling somebody to pull the van. You know, you've got to enjoy what you're doing, or you're operating outside your calling. Or you're focusing on things you don't need to be focusing on instead of focusing on God's will. What does grumbling and complaining do? People can turn against God as a result of grumbling and complaining. If you grumble and complain enough, you'll eventually turn against God, because you'll totally overlook the goodness of God in your life. And if you're saved, you've got some goodness of God in your life. I don't care how rough life is right now. The goodness of God is operating in your life if you're saved. Focus on those blessings that God has given you. Let's look at 12 and 13. Wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. There is no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Some people get a little too proud. That I would never do that. That's pride. That's self-righteousness. When you look at somebody that's in sin and you say, well, I would never do that, you better be careful. You better be careful. That's a bad road to take yourself down, because that'll swell you up in pride, swell you up in self-righteousness, and God might just say, let's see if you will. He might just lower the hedge a little bit, let the devil come in and tempt you. People that say, well, if I had kids, I would never let them act that way. You better be careful. The minute you say it, you know what? You'll have kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, somebody in that family that'll be that way or worse. They'll do it. You know, we've got to be careful about putting ourselves up. That's putting yourself up as an idol. Look at me. I have arrived. No, you haven't. Step back down off that. Give God the throne back. You know, you can't do that. We will be tempted. We will. The devil is going to tempt us. Sometimes God allows temptation to come into our lives. He allows trials. He allowed the devil to do all he did to Job. The devil said, well, you've got a hedge around him. And God said, go ahead. You can have everything except his life. And then Job endured great loss. Great loss. He was faced with difficulties in life. But you know, when we're faced with difficulties in life, when we're tempted, God will provide a way of escape. He'll provide us a way out. Just because things don't go your way doesn't mean God isn't with you. I've had things in my life that did not turn out the way I thought they should have gone. I had this picture when I was young and dumb of I was going to be another version of my mama. I was going to have a house full of kids, and I was going to sit home and be mama and housewife and have a man that worked and brought the check home to me. That didn't quite happen that way because that wasn't God's plan for me. That wasn't God's plan. That wasn't how things turned out. Sometimes we get these plans for what we're going to do when we need to say, God, what is your plan for my life? What do you want me to do? Where do you want me to focus my time and my energy? Let's look at 14 through 22. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge ye what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, being many, are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread. Behold, Israel, after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What say I then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? But I say that the things which Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? The Corinthians were in a city that was known for pagan worship. They had temples to other gods. And apparently, from Paul's writing here, some of these people who had come to Christ and were calling themselves Christians were also engaging in some of the idol worship at these other temples. You can't mix Christianity, true Christianity, with other religion. You can't practice serving God and serving the devil at the same time. That's not going to work. We know that. I mean, I don't think anybody in here best of my knowledge, is, doing any kind of satanic worship or, anything like that, worshiping any kind of false gods. But are we careful about what we're mixing with our Christian walk? Are we careful about that? Paul says here to flee idolatry. Run away from it. Are you running away from things that are not healthy in your relationship with Christ? Are you going toward them? What are you mixing with your testimony? When people think of you, what do they associate you with? I have to ask myself, are the people watching my life confused by my daily choices while I profess Christ as my Savior? Am I sending mixed messages? Because people are watching your life. They are. You may not even realize who's watching you. There are people who watch your life. They watch to see what you're doing, what you're saying, what you're watching, how you're talking to people, what you're saying about your church, what you're saying about that homeless person that gets in your way every time you're trying to drive home? And you wish they'd just get over in the ditch out of the way? What are you doing that's sending a mixed message about Christ? It's a serious thing to mix the wrong thing with the blood of Christ and with the body of Christ. We are partakers of Christ, and we are now a part of his body. It's my prayer for me personally that everything I do and I say will point people to Christ, that I won't send a mixed message, that people won't be confused by what's coming from my mouth if I attend Gruetli Church of God, and what's coming from my actions of what I didn't know Christian people acted that